Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we are going to be talking about the all-important budget tier list. And no, this is not a pitch for you to pledge on my Patreon. In fact, it's kind of the exact opposite. Although I do distribute my spreadsheet through my Patreon page, it is not behind a paywall because I know all Magic players somewhere in their little Timmy hearts love to build decks. And I think it's very important to have good information so that you can take your resources for Arena and apply them in the best way possible. And while I do believe my Patreon is just chock full of value, I don't want to put something like this behind a paywall. It is absolutely available to even the free level members. So be sure to check that out. So I'm always working on improving these free resources for the community, and some recent changes would be the inclusion of more non-standard decks because of course Alchemy is a thing, the Eternal formats are a thing, and Brawl and Standard Brawl, all things. And depending upon how you spend your primary time, whether it's standard or not, it's always good to have a secondary outlet because, you know, standard gets stale sometimes. Other recent updates include hyperlinks from the decks directly to the content, talking about it, or deck lists. And I have most recently added my thoughts on the spreadsheet regarding the upcoming fall rotation. Yes, I know it's 6 months away, but it's never too early to have that in mind when you're talking about putting your resources into a deck list. I've also included my thoughts on what I think is going to be included as archetypes for the next iteration of starter decks. So maybe you don't want to put your resources into a deck that you might end up getting for free anyway, as well as what I think decks might be missing, etc., etc. All out there 100% for free. Perhaps even more importantly, there are some things that you are not going to see around here. One of which is I don't do zero rare decks. Aside from Pauper and Artisan, there really is no honor or benefit in building a deck with zero rares just so you can splash it into a title or thumbnail. Everyone starts with somewhere like 60 to 90 playable rares on day one, and ignoring those resources, in my opinion, is just as bad as spending your wildcards all willy-nilly on somebody's deck of the day. So we don't do that here. Similarly, there is no magic number of acceptable wildcards. I see 5 thrown around by a lot of folks. I'm not going to show you a deck that only has 5 wildcards if it needs 8 or 10 or whatever. I show you decks that are solid starting points for interesting, budget-friendly decks. I help you decide how to spend your resources and then let you make the decision. This season, I'm hanging out with the friends here in Bloomcurrow, and, well, I don't really look any different. Apparently, I'm always in beast mode. And if you want your Magic the Gathering experience on and off Arena to be in beast mode too, make sure to check out my Patreon page because, let's be honest, not everything makes it to YouTube. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Starting this conversation off, first and foremost, I want to be clear that this is a conversation about budget decks, not meta decks. See, meta decks are intended and thought of as the pinnacle of what an archetype can be within a particular format. It's the culmination of all the groupthink, all the data that's out there, the performance criteria, etc. But it is not necessarily the only version of the deck that has merit, and oftentimes a budget deck can give very similar performance with a lot less resources. This doesn't mean meta decks are bad, they're just not the only available answer, particularly to folks like ourselves that might be new, free to play, or have a budget of some sort. The idea here is that we are focused away from the meta decks towards those budget alternatives so that we can get the most near meta bang for our budget buck. There are a number of factors that I consider when I'm evaluating these decks. Of course, first and foremost is how playable is the deck, because if it's not going to help you grind out those daily wins, it's probably not an ideal candidate. Secondly, how much support does this deck get from things like your starter decks, your jump-in resources, and just following the plan? Next up, a deck needs to be timely, whether that is about those resources and how likely you are to continue collecting those resources, or is the deck due for a ban, or maybe it's coming up on its rotation. And of course, formats play a factor as well. If a deck is likely to do something in a non-standard format, whether that is Alchemy, Eternal formats, or one of the Brawl bases, it's good to have flexible deck concepts. One thing you'll notice that isn't here is how fun a deck is, because fun is a very subjective thing, and I'm not here to tell you the quote-unquote right way to have fun. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood rating system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good decks are just that. These are what represent your best daily grinder decks, and the best places for you to invest your resources to get the optimal result to effort ratios. These decks tend to be a full standard deviation mathematically above the moving average of all the decks that we're looking at. Bad decks, on the other hand, tend to be a little more tongue-in-cheek as far as the naming convention. These decks are, in fact, centered around that moving average of all the other decks. And despite what the name might imply, these decks are still perfectly playable. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend putting a lot of resources into these decks because they're just not as well positioned as the good right now. But of course, as card pools and metas change, these could very easily shift up or down the spectrum. And finally, ugly decks are sadly just that. Although these might have been in-season darlings, they just didn't pan out the way they wanted to, and it's not really worth investing resources into these decks. But if you already have them and enjoy them, there's really no harm in playing these existing decks. They just don't seem to have a pathway to move out of this particular category, although from time to time you might see one of these move up. All right, so let's start looking at the budget meta environment. And as usual, I like to start with the ugly decks to kind of get those out of the way. And not surprisingly, a full half of the starter decks at the beginning of the season are pretty much already in this tier 3 ugly position. One in particular, Desert Oasis, actually downgraded to ugly. Not necessarily because the deck got any worse, but because the competitive environment, the other decks it's competing with for its slot in our arsenal got a bit better. Similarly, Simic Frogs is doing better in Constructed than I originally expected it to do, but it's still not the best Simic option out there. I do think there is a potentially strong Bant Blink deck brewing up in the standard cards, but really I have opted to put that on the back burner for the moment. I just don't think it's worth developing. Maybe next season, maybe once we see what is going to be in the Foundations collection as far as rare dual lands, this deck might become more budget viable. Lastly, in this category, we've got decks like Insidious Roots, which is just kind of underperforming at the moment. but maybe a set like Duskmoor brings something new to the table and makes that more playable. Slime Time, the Green X Slime Against Humanity deck, is still really failed to come together, and I think it's the deck that is most closely ready to drop off the radar. I personally am willing to give this about one more season, and then I'm pretty much going to stop thinking about it. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a lot of people might be surprised to see the Simic Rabbits deck in the ugly category, particularly when it has a 56% win rate. And this is another one of those things that it's not that the deck is bad, it's what else it's competing with. Right now, the Selesnya decks, the white-green decks, have several good options, not the least of which is the Saddle Up Mounts deck from the starter that's fairly good right out of the gate and doesn't need any resources whatsoever. And as we'll see later, the Mono White Rabbits deck is actually performing just as well without the need for some of the heavy lifting rares that the Selesnya Rabbits deck are pretty dependent on. The last thing that sort of fits into this category by default are some of those budget decks from prior seasons, prior years, that are really at an inopportune moment to start building. Not the least of which is the Mono Blue Jin decks or Mono Blue Control decks. These decks are still perfectly playable, and if you have them, there's absolutely no reason not to play them. However, if you haven't already invested in these, it's not a great time to start doing so. Hadi Jin, for example, is going to be rotating out of standard at the end of this budget year. So spending 4 rares that you're going to get less than a year's worth of standard play out of isn't really a very budget-minded idea. But again, if you already have these decks, continuing to invest in them and use them as an active part of your arsenal is still a good idea. Alright, so now let's switch gears and talk about those decks on the opposite end of the spectrum, that Tier 1 good category that represents the very best return, the most bang, if you would, for your budget buck. We already talked about the starter Saddle Up, that's pretty good out of the box. It does get better with the addition of just a single jump-in pack. Of course, there is also the Dinosaur Theme Starter Deck, which is, again, very good right out of the box. And about everything you want or need to upgrade this is in your starter collection, just needs to be shifted into this deck build. Of course, I've got various lists out there for that to assist for the newcomers. This dinosaur deck also makes the new pre-constructed standard deck, and its roughly $50 price tag, well, kind of silly, to be honest. Especially since these two very similarly themed dino decks have nearly identical win rates and very different costs when it comes to rare wildcards. But wait, there's even more good news from Bloomcurrow. This new set spawned at least 3 good budget meta decks. Of course, we have talked about the Orzhov White-Black Bat Life deck that I have nicknamed Batitude. It's pretty darn good. Another somewhat sleeper that I haven't put out a list for yet is Mono Black Discard. Yep, come to the dark side. We have cookies. Also, the Boros Valiant Mice deck is really solid, even though I recommend skipping it. Put those red Valiant Mice in your up-and-coming mono-red Prowess deck and focus your remaining energies on that mono-white Rabbits deck, all of which we discussed earlier in the mono-white section of the video. Now, if you're happy with all of your Tier 1 good deck progress, but you still want to keep brewing, that's when you want to turn towards the Tier 2 bad but still playable decks. Of course, we've got a couple things in here built on the Outlaws deck, the newly formed Outlaw Lizards variant with a 56% win rate, and of course a standard Brawl deck that this time I don't believe I have published, built around our friend Jasper. Of course, we've also got the red-white Boros Humans build with a marginal win rate of 55%. Artifact Pirates in the blue-red, which I think is the preferred build for Izzet at the moment, but still not entirely accessible for those that weren't around last year. An impressive win rate with Simic Cookies, 60%, y'all. That deck is just doing fantastic. And in fact, I think my personal win rate is a little higher than that, but it's projected at 60% based on card choices. Also looking at a white-blue Artifact Matters Simic sort of build there. Not sure exactly what we end up with on those. Time will remain to see. And of course, that Izzet Captain Storm Brawl deck from last year is still a very good, solid option for those looking to expand their Brawl opportunities. So there it is, guys. That's what's on my radar this season for budget decks, helping you get the most bang for your budget buck. But what are your thoughts? Did I leave anything out? Do you feel like I've over or underrated a deck? Now is your opportunity to contribute your thoughts as well. Hit those comments down below. Let me know what you're thinking. And before we go, while every member of this community is important to me, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to those patrons providing financial support and keeping the Stronghold from being a complete financial black hole. And of course, let me leave you with some suggestions for your next step here on the channel.